All right, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Network 2020's discussion today. I am Courtney Doggart, and I'm the president of Network 2020. It's a pleasure to have two great guests today, whom I will shortly introduce after a few words about Network 2020. So just for those of you who might be joining us for the first time, Network 2020 is a New York-based nonprofit, and we're really focused on creating greater access to conversations about international affairs and greater nuance in those conversations. So we're very privileged to bring leading experts on a range of topics that are happening in international affairs to our audiences, both in New York in person and around the world. And so we encourage everyone to follow us on social media and sign up for our newsletter or even join as a member. So with that, it is a great pleasure to introduce our guest today. We'll be talking about rearming Europe. And first we have Dr. Rob de Wijk. He is the founder and the director of the Hague Centre for Strategic Studies. He is a professor of international relations and security at the Institute of Security and Global Affairs at Leiden University. And as I learned, he also runs a daily podcast that is, I believe, one of the most popular in the Netherlands. So if we can find that, we will pop that into the chat for you all as well. So welcome, Rob. And I'm also very pleased to welcome Sander Tordoir. He is chief economist at the Center for European Reform. He is an expert on the Eurozone monetary policy and the institutional architecture of the Euro monetary union and European integration, as well as Germany's role in the EU. Both of them have far more accomplishments than I will read today, but you'll get a flavor for their work. So with that, it's a pleasure to welcome both of you. It's a pleasure to welcome the audience. Rob, I'd love to start with you. If you could just walk us through a little bit about how Europe's security environment has evolved in recent years, what some of the drivers of the shift has been, and what are some of the internal debates in Europe at the moment
Yeah.
about common
Well, first of
defense.
all, thank you for having me here. Um, I think we in Europe missed a couple of wake-up calls. I think that is very important to start with. For example, 2014, the annexation of the Crimea by Russia, it did very little. Of course, we had a meeting then with NATO, and there was an agreement that the defense budget should come up, but not really something happened. Then, of course, we had the next step. That was February 22. That was the intervention by Russia in Ukraine, and that had some effect. As of 2023, you see that the defense budgets were increasing in Europe, but not really. The big change was President Trump. He achieved something that could not be achieved by President Putin, and that is rearming Europe. And that's quite interesting that this happened and that we didn't had the same reaction to the annexation of the Crimea or the intervention by Russia in Ukraine. But President Trump really was the wake-up call. And that is related to the idea that Article 5, which is the collective defense clause of NATO, might not be as strong as most Europeans thought it would be. And that was the trigger for really a big change in Europe on defense, on international security, on geopolitics. All of a sudden, the European Union came to the conclusion that indeed Europe should be a geopolitical player. All of a sudden, we came to the conclusion that yes, we have to invest in our defenses. If not, we might be at the mercy of President Putin, and that is something we simply do not want. So it has a huge impact. And if you look what happened over the last couple of months, it's quite impressive. I myself was really surprised what happened in Europe. The defense budgets increased. We had this NATO pledge of 5%, 3.5% for real defense spending, 1.5% for something else, which could be infrastructure or, for example, defense against cyber attacks. And of course, we had the whole project Rearm Europe of the European Union, which goes hand in hand with the relaxation of the fiscal rules in Europe. And that has huge implications also for the defense budget. So together, NATO and the European Union forced Europeans to do more in Europe.
All right, great. Thank you. Turning to you, Sander, we've seen, as Rob just mentioned, some major financial commitments from both national governments as well as the European Commission. Can you just give us an overview of how these new defense initiatives are expected to be financed? You know, do you think things like common borrowing, like Eurobonds, are an option, or do you see more individual countries taking the lead?
Yeah, thank you. Maybe just one observation to start, which is, you know, as Rob was saying, I think there's a kind of narrative in the US that Mr. Trump is the driving force behind Europe's stepped up defense spending. And while that may be true to an extent, if you actually look at defense spending since 2022, it already went up considerably before Mr. Trump came to power. So you should really see this as a kind of two-stage rocket, with the first real bump kind of happening in 2022 until Trump's election, and then the next big jump kind of happening as we speak. Maybe just a few conceptual points, Courtney, since you're asking. So, you know, one kind of common trope in the European debate is that somehow private finance can solve Europe's defense problems. Now, that is an utterly nonsensical idea, because the only buyer of military equipment is governments, right? And so you can improve the plumbing of private finance to make firms better able to meet that public demand. But ultimately, this is really a discussion about public money. The second conceptual point that I think you were asking is kind of, do you want to do Eurobonds or member states borrowing, which already implicitly assumes that we're going to do it via borrowing. And I think that's roughly right. Europe has such an acute security crisis on its hands that the only viable way to quickly step up defense spending is by going to the markets. And I think that's an entirely defensible choice. Down the line, obviously, as you know, the multipliers, the economic multipliers of not buying equipment that you also produce and having quite sort of economically beneficial military Keynesianism, if you want, over time, a lot of that CAPEX will turn into OPEX, right? So you have just personnel costs, and you basically have a bunch of tanks lying around that you ideally wouldn't actually use. So it's by definition unproductive. I think at that stage, you want to have a discussion in Europe about reprioritizing spending and maybe doing cuts in social welfare or raising taxes. So maybe that's just to lay the land. Now, the choice that Europe has made is not one for Eurobonds. I think there are clear advantages to common borrowing, not least because for many European member states, particularly those in the East, it's actually cheaper in terms of borrowing costs than doing it individually. Because it solves a lot of political problems, like Spain and Portugal and Italy, who are far away from the Russian threat, who may be tempted to free ride on the spending of Poland and Germany. But that's not the choice that was made. I think Rob already said it. The choice that Europe made was essentially to do most of it via loosening curbs on national borrowing with the European fiscal rules, and thus letting member states take the lead. And I think that has very profound implications. It essentially means that the low debt countries of Europe, led by Germany, which has a debt to GDP ratio of around 60, I think most Americans would jealously eye that low debt ratio, but also Denmark, Netherlands, even Poland, which has a fairly low debt ratio and is a high growth country. All of them will be basically leading the charge. And so I think as a question of fiscal arithmetic, the security architecture of Europe will look very different 5 years from today than it does now, with much more of the additional capabilities being brought online by Scandinavia, Germany, and Poland, and less by the old defense security strongholds, the UK and France, both of whom do not have a lot of fiscal space.
All right, great. And I will want to follow up on that point at some point. But Rob, just turning to you, and maybe this actually is a good place to do that. How do you see the military coordination in Europe evolving? Will it continue to take place primarily through NATO, through the EU, or via regional groupings? And then related to what Sander just said, how does the different spending capabilities and leadership among some of the European countries impact how you see that coordination evolving?
Yeah, it will probably take place in ad hoc coalitions. That is something that is visible already now for a couple of months, half a year approximately. As of the inauguration of President Trump, it really is completely different now from, let's say, a year ago in Europe. Look what happened today. That's quite interesting. There was an agreement signed by Germany and UK, a security pact, a defense pact, including, and that's quite interesting, including a collective defense clause. Now, the NATO treaty already includes a NATO, a collective defense clause. That is Article 5. By the way, the European Union treaty also includes one. That's Article 42.7. But let's focus on NATO. It's rather strange, in a way, that there is a new defense clause in this security or defense pact between Germany and the UK. And the reason is, of course, trust. Can we trust President Trump? Can we trust Article 5 in the NATO treaty? That is really quite something. This is the first time in my life that someone questions the credibility of Article 5. What's also quite interesting is that I think it was 2 weeks ago, 1 or 2 weeks ago, time flies, that there was an agreement between the UK and France on nuclear cooperation. And that is also quite interesting, and that is also meaningful because what you see is that there is also a reluctance to accept the extended deterrence of the US as a credible deterrence for Europe. And some countries now believe that they have to do it on their own. Now, the problem is, of course, that the European Union is the organization that takes the lead in capability development. It also has the money. NATO not. NATO sets the standards, sets the technical standards of weapon systems, for example. It set also the standards for doctrines. The point is, of course, which organization can run the show. That is probably the European Union, not NATO. And that has huge implications, of course, for transatlantic cooperation, but also for the UK, because the UK is outside the European Union. Now, what happened is that both the UK and Canada joined the European Union in also a security and defense pact. And that's quite interesting, of course, but it is completely different. And this is something that was unimaginable a year ago. Also, Canada can now make use of European money in the so-called SAFE agreement, which is 150 billion borrowed money. It can be used now also by the UK and Canada. So what we see is ad hoc coalitions. And one of the ad hoc coalitions is built around the so-called Weimar Triangle. The Weimar Triangle was established in the early 1990s by France, Germany, and Poland. Now, what you see is that the UK is left outside. So the trick is to have something like Weimar Plus, which includes the UK. Now, if you look what's happening here, then this is already the start of a European Security Council. And that is also quite interesting what's happening here. So the European Union and NATO still play a hugely important role. Probably what we will see in the future is a European NATO. America will probably be a member of that organization, but not the main member. It could join NATO operations, but if it doesn't want to do so, it can abstain. So what you see here is that a couple of countries now try to take the lead. There has always been a discussion about European leadership, but finally the Europeans show some leadership. And that's quite encouraging in my view.
Just as one follow-up question to that, with all of these ad hoc agreements, if
Yeah.
they do start to proliferate, what I find interesting, and I'm curious to get your take on this, is that a couple of years ago, the conversation was, pre-2022 was, has NATO lost its purpose? And then after Russia's second invasion of Ukraine, it became very much, NATO's found its purpose. Do these ad hoc arrangements, do they really start to erode NATO? And what would NATO look like in 5 to 10 years if that continues?
Yeah, that's a good question because they make use of NATO. For example, you should not abolish NATO. There is also consensus about this. President Macron in France, he mentioned NATO as a brain dead organization. Quite a few people in Europe, politicians, but also experts, declared NATO brain dead after the election of President Trump. And this is not true. What you see is that you need NATO. I already mentioned the standardization agreements, but also the headquarters, command and control arrangements. Um, if you abolish NATO, if you terminate it, you have to come up with something not different, but something similar. And that is, of course, quite important because we need NATO for standardization purposes. We have to fight in a similar way. We have to come up with similar standards for ammunition, for example. And that means that we need NATO. So we need it, but the organization will run in a completely different way. It will run by ad hoc coalitions as far as we know now. And for example, Turkey cannot always join forces. This is also, and I think that is also quite important, the security problem is a problem of Northern Europe, not of Southern Europe. You see a divide within Europe where the southern countries are more reluctant to spend more on defense than the northern countries. But if something happens in Europe, it happens in the region where I live, in Northern Europe. And that means that France and UK will join forces, and Germany. And at the same time, it's the European Union who is going to provide the capabilities or the capability development.
Great, thank you for that clarification. Sander, looking at Readiness 2030 and this renewed NATO spending pledge, what do you see as the implications for Europe's defense industry? And does the EU have the industrial capacity to meet this demand? Or do you think we'll see continued reliance on US-made weapons systems? And sort of how does that factor into, transatlantic relations?
Yeah, great question. I think in principle, the answer is yes. So if you just look at Europe's manufacturing strength, and I'm speaking of the broader industrial base, which is always important if you think about defense manufacturing as well, it's much stronger than the US, actually. So manufacturing is 16% of EU GDP. It's only 11% in the US. So 16 versus 11. And Europe has 30 million people in manufacturing employment, only 13 million in the US. Now, of course, these people are not all working in defense. They're working in aircraft manufacturing, vehicle production, steel, chemicals, you name it. But they have, a certain degree of transferable skills to a larger defense sector. And you see this actually happening already in Germany, which for, the last 5 years or so has had declining industrial production because of the energy crisis unleashed by Russia's war in Ukraine, and because China is hammering into Germany's core sectors. So capacity utilization in German industry is actually fairly low. Germany has lost 50% of its net auto exports, so half. So there's a lot of idle capacity in German industry, and you see that from the Porsche family to Volkswagen to even Mercedes, they're all thinking of building parts for defense industry. And so there is a real kind of industrial rotation happening in Germany, and I think that holds for wider Europe. And again, the broader manufacturing base is there, but it's also a broader manufacturing base that is under pressure from high energy prices and Chinese state-led competition. So it's quite an interesting moment for industry. I think there are three models. One is the existing model where we basically build more than 10 different types of main battle tanks in Europe. It is an incredibly inefficient industry that lacks scale and standardization. And that's basically a political problem. So are countries willing to basically decide to standardize this? That's model one. I hope we move away from that model, but I'm not confident. Model two is one where different countries would specialize in different types of kit that they're already good at. So the obvious choice would be Germany builds military vehicles. They're already more or less the best at it. France builds aircraft. The Dutch build radar systems. They all have existing strengths already. And then you basically produce for each other. Requires a very high degree of trust between the member states. I'm curious if Rob sees that level of trust. I unfortunately don't really. And the third model, which is probably where we're going, is a bit more muddling through, where basically you try to push firms to not only open factories in the country that they're from, but to have factories spread out across Europe. And some of that's happening anyway. So a couple of European defense firms are expanding their supply chains into the rest of Europe, also because it makes sense, and also because they probably think it politically is more sustainable. And so that may be where we're headed. Not quite perfect standardization, but there may be a larger degree of sharing that defense industrial base across the European Union. And then finally, on the US point, there's this statistic that always goes around that Europe imports 80% of its defense equipment from the US, which is wrong. The proper way of reading that statistic is that of the defense kit that we import, I think roughly 70 or 80% comes from the US. If you look at the wider base, and the colleagues at the Kiel Institute for the Global Economy have researched this, Europe actually does already produce a lot of its own defense kits, especially France, even Germany to an extent. Poland is a little bit more reliant on US and South Korean kit, but it's already happening. And I'm curious to see how the politics pan out. And I'm wondering if American defense firms are going to be all that happy if in 5 years' time there are a couple of European firms that may be very competitive in the defense space.
And do you see, I'm curious, do you see this push in building out the defense industrial base? A lot has been made of innovation within Europe, and I'm curious just to get your sense, do you see this push as having an impact on innovation within Europe more broadly?
I think that's a tough one. So one of the reasons to, favor some kind of European spending is that a lot of European defense spending is not on R&D. So the US, has, I think, 5 or 6 times as much R&D spending in defense, often with spillovers to the more civilian industries, the sort of Pentagon innovation projects. And Europe is clearly very far behind on that, and it's quite fragmented too, like the battle tanks example. And we're not really putting European money on the table, so I'm a little bit bearish on that. I hope that will step up, but I don't think that the sort of framework conditions that have now been laid are very conducive to that. It is possible that when there's a next EU budget after 2027, some money will be put into these types of programs. It is also possible that Germany and France will agree on a targeted set of Eurobonds for really common defense projects, think space projects, air defense, and the like. But the jury is very much out on that, and clearly common debt is always a very sensitive topic here in Berlin.
Okay, thank you. Rob, turning to you now and jumping off on this conversation we had about a little bit about transatlantic relations and where buying might be. Relations with Washington. What impact do you think a more military capable and autonomous Europe might have on transatlantic relations?
We already see that the transatlantic relations are in trouble. Quite a few people in Europe believe that what started in 1941 with the Atlantic Charter is now over. It was the Transatlantic Charter was again signed by President Biden, and I think it was Prime Minister Johnson in the UK in 2021. And this is over. So this is the push for the monumental changes that are now taking place in Europe. So this is all about trust. So that is also what I meant earlier when I talked about trust, not trust within Europe, because we are now forced to work together if we want it or not. But it's transatlantic trust that is really put under pressure, and it almost disappeared for quite a few people. That explains why Europe is doing what it is doing right now. Now, I think we Europeans, because of this, have a short-term problem. We have to act fast because you simply cannot rebuild your armed forces, let's say, in 10 or 15 years. You have to do it now. You have to do it within 1 or 2 or 3 years, quickly. Because if you look at what the intelligence people are telling us is that Russia might be capable of launching an attack on NATO within, let's say, 3 years. If that is true, it simply doesn't matter, but we do not have 10 to 15 years. And if you cannot trust the US, unfortunately, because I love that, but well, that's what it is right now, then you have to act fast. And that means that you need to have a plan to increase your defense capabilities. And we simply cannot do that in Europe. And we cannot do it also with the US because we have a lack of some, for example, long-range systems. We cannot procure them from the US, but what we should do, and that's exactly what's going on right now, we have to procure them in and to develop them with Ukraine. So we are now looking at Ukraine for our deficiencies. And that also means that we need to invest, for example, in command and control systems to be able to have European military operations. We simply cannot do that. We need the US for that. On the other hand, we have sufficient satellite capabilities, so we can do that, but we do not have a backbone. The backbone now can be provided by Ukraine. That's a so-called Delta system. So we are now working on that and try to answer the question how to integrate this system into our national systems. And that can be done. If the US withdraws its own troops, we're already working on that. If you look what happened in the Netherlands, the decision has been made to increase the number of armed forces of the Netherlands from 70 to 200,000. If all countries do that, you don't need America anymore. Then it comes down to the last remaining issue, and that's nuclear. And that is the reason why the UK and France are now moving forward and trying to come up with new ideas about deterrence in Europe. So in the end, this will have huge consequences for transatlantic relations. But in a way, it's a good thing that what President Trump did, because we now understand that the world is changing, and each and every president after President Trump will be a president that is looking to Asia, not to Europe. This is part of the changing geopolitical situation. You Americans have to look at China, and we have to look. And we should be responsible for our own security. So transatlantic relations are changing anyway. I think that transatlantic relations will be more pragmatic in the future. It will be more transactional, so it will change. And the big driver for change is not President Trump, but geopolitical change, the rise of China, and the way you Americans deal with China.
All right, great, thank you. And I'm just going to try to get in one more question. So if you're listening and you have any questions that you'd like, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box. Sander, last question for you. could the investment strategies under the Readiness 2030 plan lead to formal or informal buy European policies? So as that seems to be a trend these days. And if so, how might that affect the US defense industry's access to EU markets?
That's a great question. I think the buy European push is broader than just defense. I think it is actually driven by maybe two geopolitical shocks. One is the one, in fact, that Professor de Wijk just described, which is the weaning security commitment of the US to Europe, and thereby also the sort of victory of the French Gaullist perspective that Europe needs to have its own defense capabilities in all strategic realms. Maybe at times you can still buy American, but you certainly don't want to be solely reliant on the US in any particular important category. The other geopolitical imperative has very little, in fact, to do with defense, and I think it's the trade war ongoing. It is the pressure that China's exploding surplus and exports are putting on not just American manufacturing, but all of Western manufacturing and European manufacturing, and China's long-standing system of basically having Chinese preferences in all its policies. And so the way, and I've certainly been an advocate of this, in all honesty, that the only way in which Europe can, basically shield this very still strong manufacturing base is by steering some of its own demand into its own industry in a global market where some demand, particularly Chinese demand, but also American demand, given US tariffs, may no longer be available to European manufacturers. So I think that those are really the driving forces. Now, defense in some ways is easier than, say, electric vehicles or batteries, because as I said at the very beginning, it's a public market. So governments can actually set conditions fairly easily. And legally, it's quite simple because defense isn't very close to national security. I do not think that the lawyers of the World Trade Organization, which may in fact now be a brain dead organization, will start throwing books at us the moment that we say we want buy European preferences in defense policies. When we do that in private markets, it's a lot more complicated. Now, I think that's very much the mood music, but other considerations will play a role. For example, where the trade war between the EU and the US will go, I think will have some implications for how open Europeans will still be to buy US kit generally, but also defense kit. And I think it will depend in part on availability and expediency. And so you see that, for example, Poland, which maybe in line with what Rob was saying, was ahead of the crowd in terms of stepping up its defense rather quickly because it was worried about getting invaded. It just bought wherever it could, right? And so Poland ended up buying, for example, a lot of South Korean equipment and ammunition because European firms that they probably would have preferred were unable to deliver as quickly as the Polish government wanted. So that too will play a role, but the mood music is certainly one where European governments, even Germany, which for a long time was very pro-American, will not really want to rely on US tech, with exceptions.
Great. And I lied. I do have one follow-up question. I'll pose it to you, Sander, first. And Rob, if you'd like to join in, please do. And this is on the China point. And Sander, what you mentioned about all the goods from China and how that has been having a destabilizing effect. This seems to be a common problem and one that could use a common solution, but in light of what's happening with transatlantic relations, how do you see that evolving? I mean, it seems like now these are also fragmented solutions where Europe is dealing with it on its own and maybe the US is dealing with it on its own. Is that what you're seeing, or are the trend lines different in that particular area?
Dependencies are quite important, if I may. Critical raw materials, for example, we don't have them in Europe. You have a lack of them in the US, and without that, we cannot have a defense industry and no high-tech industry. We cannot have green policies. So we need that. and that is a big obstacle also to become Europe more autonomous. What do you think, Sander?
No, I would completely agree. And I think President Trump found out the hard way that China's chokehold on critical raw materials and minerals is very significant. And without an American long-term industrial policy, and in my ideal world, a Japanese, European, American, Canadian, Australian industrial policy to
Sure.
wean us off this chokehold, it is very hard to stand up to China. And in fact, Mr. Trump, for all his strong rhetoric, had to back down considerably when China actually basically withheld these critical raw materials from American industry. And as a knock-on effect, to your point, Courtney, European industry also got hit by the fact that there are now export restrictions on basically all the exports of this, which is creating a hell of a bureaucracy in China. So even if there's no ill intent, it's pretty hard for a European firm to get their hands on this stuff now because firms in China just don't know what they're allowed to export anymore.
Yeah.
So I think it's very much a shared challenge. My writings and my preferred sort of policy solutions would have been a joint Western response to China's really exploding trade surplus and the distortions that its state-led capitalism and frankly its genuine innovation are creating in global markets. But that is not the approach that I see from the Trump administration. The approach from the Trump administration is America first, and it's very much America alone. At this stage, Trump is threatening the same tariff level against the EU as that he has against China, 30%. And
It's a
so I do not
high-risk
see much chance of close coordination on this for now. Sorry, Rob.
Yeah, sorry, I completely agree because it's a high-risk strategy. Because under normal circumstances, you would like to see that the US, the UK, the EU, Japan, South Korea, Australia would team up, and that doesn't happen right now. It's a fragmented situation here, and that is probably not good to win this battle with China. I think they will laugh in Beijing.
All right, thank you. Okay, turning to the Q&A box, we have a few questions coming in, and if you're listening, please feel free to jump in and ask your own, and I will get to as many as we can. So starting off with a big picture one, and I'll direct this to you, Rob, and it goes to the heart of the name of this conversation, which is about rearming Europe, right? So a bit long. I'll get through as much of it as I can. So the questioner writes about President Roosevelt in his State of the Union address in 1941 outlined a vision of 4 freedoms, including freedom from fear, including the reduction of armament so that all countries could live in peace. At that time, Germany had conquered most of Europe and was threatening war on Russia. Yada, yada. Now Germany is leading the armament drive in Europe with 800 billion euros in planned spending. So basically the question is history repeating itself? What does this say for the future of Europe and for the vision of freedom from fear? And are we preparing for another war in Europe, or could there be a pathway to peace that we could pursue?
Well, rearming Europe is part of our effort to prevent another war in Europe, because what happened over the last couple of months has led to the idea that Europe is quite vulnerable. And we neglected our armed forces for more than 3 decades. And it is too late. And we have to act quickly. Well, I already explained how to do that because we need Ukraine for that. And we need, of course, put much more effort in our own defense industries. But if you look what's happening right now behind the scenes, it's really incredible. For example, the cooperation between the European Union and Ukraine, for example, for developing drone systems is really quite impressive. By the way, Ukraine can also make use of this of this money provided by the European Union. These are the common borrowing monies, the safe money. They can make use of that as well, and it's happening right now. So we try to prevent the war, but the world is changing, and I already explained that because of geopolitical shifts, we will have a completely different position within the international arena. The US has to look at China. We have to have another position vis-à-vis the US, but also vis-à-vis China. So the world is changing. So history is not repeating itself. What we see is that the domination of the West has come to an end. This is about rise of China. So we have to adapt to this new situation. And what happens right now is that there is a battle going on between the US and China for the #1 position in the world. That is only logical that something like that takes place right now. We Europeans have to come up with conclusions about this battle and how to organize ourselves in this new geopolitical situation. That's what it is. So this is not a repetition of history. This is something completely new.
Okay, great. Thank you. Sander, we have a question here about about the decision-making process in terms of expenditures. And I know, this might be a follow-on to your path 3 about muddling through. And so, how do you see the decision-making process going in terms of expenditures, and how is that going to ensure that all gaps are filled in, let's say?
Thanks. I think Rob might know the sort of military industrial planning side of the NATO part of the ledger a bit better than I do. But what I can say is I think the member states again will be in the driving seat. So the major source of leeway that they've gotten is that any spending on defense that they do over their 2021 levels, they can basically go 1.5% of GDP over that, which roughly gets you to Mark Rutte's 3.5 on average. And that the European Commission basically for 4 years will exempt that from the European fiscal rules. And so that is one really important decision, which in turn means that the member states can relatively freely spend on, defense as they see fit. And obviously it's then up to each member state, be it Germany or Denmark or Netherlands or France, how they want to align with NATO capability planning, with the European coordinations on those. And so the modeling through kind of follows from that, because it basically becomes quite a messy exercise where each member state will talk to its industry and say, what can you provide? There obviously is always a political instinct and incentive to try to give as many orders as you can to your own industry, but perhaps some politicians are wise enough to know that limited scale also means high cost. And so the more that they can use the European market and its scale and the fact that there are specializations and efficiencies there that they can bring out, the more they might call, probably in the ad hoc coalition way that Rob was describing, the more they might call firms in other places. And of course, competition will also pick up a bit. In the EU, in fact, for example, interesting story that's been in the German press for a while is that the only steel company that can provide steel, military grade steel for armored vehicles is a Swedish company now. And several German steel makers who have not had the best few years are now getting back into that business. And as an economist, I can only applaud that, because that means there'll be some competition. So, I think that's sort of the picture.
Yeah.
Great. We have a couple questions here, and I'll start with you, Rob, that are fairly similar. And it's about the risks of fragmentation within the EU. So one question is, are there risks of fragmentation within the EU if wealthier or more industrialized nations dominate defense production while others remain consumers? And how can defense integration be made more equitable? And then related to that is, how will NATO and EU deal with the countries that might question increased military expenditure, such as Hungary and Slovakia, especially given their positive sentiments towards Russia? So slightly different questions. Maybe Rob, you can take the second, and Sander the first. Happy to repeat either of those.
Yeah. Well, if you look at the behavior of Hungary and Slovakia, well, a similar debate takes place in Slovenia, but also in Spain. I was during the NATO summit in The Hague, and it was clear that Spain didn't want to spend 3.5% GDP on defense. It simply refused to do so. Now, if you look at at the communique that was written before the summit, it was mentioned that the allies and we should spend 3.5% GDP on defense. But in the final communique, it was only mentioned that allies will spend that amount of money on defense. That means that there is room to maneuver for the individual member states. So you do not need to spend that much money on defense. What does it mean? Is this the end of the world? No, because there is a real difference in views on the security situation in Europe. We in the northern part of Europe feel threatened, the southern part of Europe not. So it is only logical that countries in the southern part of Europe have much more problems with the relaxation of the fiscal rules than we have in the northern part of Europe. Now, how it works in the European Union, but also in NATO, is that you always have a group of countries who take the lead, and then you hope that the rest will follow. And that is usually the case. So yes, fragmentation is always a problem. Fragmentation in the defense industry is always a problem. It leads to sub or optimal solutions. It will cost a lot of money, but on the other hand, we have a lot of money. 3.5% is a huge amount of money. If it is 5%, we spend as much on defense as the US, and we don't have global responsibilities. We don't need 10 carrier battle groups because they don't even fit in the North Sea. That is simply impossible. So we even don't need that money if we only focus on collective defense. And you can, to be honest, you can organize your collective defense, the eastern border of Europe, for not that much money. We know how to do it. If you look at Ukraine, how they do it, how they defend against the Russians on the ground, that's quite cheap. So we are going to do that as well. So I really wonder what will happen in the future, and I wonder whether countries are willing to spend 3.5% of their GDP on defense in the future. So I'm not that pessimistic here. Moreover, if we think that the threat is real, we join forces. That is normal. That's what we always do when we live in challenging times.
Thank you. Sander, do you want to take the question about risks of fragmentation as well, in terms of the wealthier industrialized countries?
Yeah, I would broadly share Rob's kind of sanguine view on this. I think, again, I think there were real benefits to having part of this push be done with common borrowing. There's the quite small SAFE program that Rob was describing, which isn't really kind of proper common spending. It's more common borrowing to bring down funding costs a little bit and then pass on those lower funding costs to member states. But basically cheap loans. But again, that's not what we decided. So, but then from a fiscal standpoint, I have no problem with the low debt countries of Europe spending more than the others, right? That is entirely reasonable. And if Denmark and the Netherlands and Germany, with their low debt levels and their very low borrowing costs, decide to do a little more, then okay, that's it's not such a bad outcome. And in some ways, there's a kind of nice overlay between the countries that for a long time did very little, precisely those, and the ones that tend to have the most fiscal space. I do not think, by the way, that's because of Trumpian sort of logic. They always ripped off the US and now they have money left over. There are much more deep economic reasons for that, but it just happens to be the case. And I think, the ones that will lag are probably Spain and maybe Italy, who have quite high debt levels and are also not doing that much on defense. Greece is actually a pretty large defense spender. and its fiscal situation is improved dramatically. So it's kind of a mixed bag, I think. And I don't know how the politics will play out. I do wonder if Paris and London might get a little bit nervous if they see the political center of gravity of Europe moving north and east. But that is a concern for a later date, I think.
And one follow-up question to that, if where we spend our money reflects our values, how does an increase in defense spending, as Rob said, it is a lot of money. How does that impact, what does that take away from in terms of Europe and its values?
Well, I think that Europe tries to stick to its values. We all know what happened when Vice President Vance went to Munich. That was really shocking Europe, because he represented the values of niche parties in Europe, not mainstream parties. That was really a shock. That also contributed to the idea that we Europeans should be more autonomous, also in the defense field, but also in the economic field. So that has huge implications. We believe that we should stick to the values like democracy, liberties, free market economy, you name it. All the values that were embedded in the first Atlantic Charter of 1941. And we want to stick with it, to that. We want to work together with countries who also support those values. And that's the reason why the European Union now has deals with Canada, the UK, but also Australia. Trade agreements will be more and more important. That's, by the way, a big problem for Europe, but that's a domestic problem. But trade deals will become more and more important for those groups of countries that want to defend those values.
Right. We have a few, I'll do a couple kind of rapid fire questions as we get towards the end here. One questioner wants to know is, how quickly can Europe replace US heavy lift capabilities upon which we, and presumably this is Europe, are wholly dependent? Rob, do you have any insight into that?
Yeah, we don't need that much heavy lift capabilities because the only thing we need to do is move troops and heavy equipment from west to east. That's the only thing we should do. So we're now working in Europe on better railway systems. Bridges should be stronger than they were, because otherwise they will collapse under the weight of tanks. So we're working on that. The 1.5% that is agreed on during the defense pledge in The Hague during the NATO summit, the 1.5%, for example, is on infrastructure. And that means that we will invest in our infrastructure in order to make possible the movement of heavy equipment and troops from west to east. But the heavy lift, that is
we just lose Rob? We may have.
That is something for the aircraft, heavy aircraft. We don't need that. We don't need strategic airlift in Europe. We only need that if we have to deal with out-of-area operations. That means that we have to do something, for example, in Africa. We will do that, and we will continue to do that. But the heavy lift capacities, in my view, right now is more or less adequate.
We have another question, Sander. I'll see if you can answer this one, which is, even if money is not a problem, will EU countries be able to raise the number of soldiers? I'm not sure who might be a better place to answer that one.
Yeah, no, that's definitely not my cup of tea. I mean, of course, it's no secret that a lot of European societies are aging, right? So in some ways, the fiscal burden of all this may be more bearable than, so it's a good question, basically. The fiscal burden may be more bearable than pulling quite a few people out of the labor market that you desperately need, because Germany, Italy are are really aging quite rapidly, and they need the workforce. So I think it's a real challenge for sure.
No, the problem is deployable troops. We really in Europe have a lack of deployable troops. So we're working on that. That's called the new force model. And one of the ideas is, and there is an agreement on this, that the Europeans should provide 300,000 deployable troops. That means deployable within, let's say, a couple of weeks. We now have only 40,000 deployable troops within 2 weeks, 15 days, something like that. So we are working on that, and so far so good. And the whole process is now speeded up, especially because of the fear that the US might withdraw some troops from Europe. The number of 20,000 was mentioned, but it could be much more. But we can compensate for that. I already mentioned the initiatives taken by the MOD in the Netherlands. If more countries do that, it will not really a problem. You don't need a force of 10 or 20 million. You need a force of 1 million or 2 million. And we can easily do that in Europe. That's not really a problem. We have 450 million Europeans within the European Union, plus extra, so that's not really a big problem.
One question we have is, what are Turkey's plans for the future in fitting into all of this? And that also brings up, I suppose, the labor question as well. Because Rob, do you want to take that? And then maybe Sander, you can jump on.
Yeah, that's almost a very tricky question because Turkey is not a member of the European Union. The European Union is now the capability provider, or the institution that provides the money for capabilities. So you have the force calls of NATO, and they should be implemented, and the European Union is organizing also the implementation of the force calls of NATO. That's also new. Turkey is outside, is not inside that process because it's not a member of the European Union. Moreover, Turkey is also is a member of NATO and plays a hugely important role in the security of, for example, the Eastern Mediterranean or the Black Sea. So yes, Turkey is extremely important from a NATO perspective, but it doesn't play a role in the whole capability development, which is spearheaded by a couple of countries, most notably the UK, France, Poland, Germany, and they work together in ad hoc coalitions.
And one last quick question before we wrap. Sander, where does that 5% number come from? Is it completely arbitrary, or is there logic behind it?
I think the 5%, it is a kind of very strong Mark Rutte play, because the 1.5 on top of the 3.5 core defense spending, it involves things like bridges and roads, as we discussed. And, as good old Europeans, we can stick a lot of existing projects and hopefully some new ones under the 1.5 and tell Washington, look, we did our job. The 3.5, I think, is, sort of backward deduced, and it also is consistent, like I was saying, with the European fiscal framework that caters for it. So I think on all sides, it's sort of the logical ballpark number.
Yeah, the 5% was a request by President Trump. And then it was argued, among others, by Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, well, you don't even spend 3.5%. You spent 3.4% of GDP in the US. So what about the 1.5%? Now, this is typical Mark Rutte. We all know him in the Netherlands because he is a long-time prime minister in this country. So he came up with 5%, but what matters is 3.5% real defense spending. And then it was explained that this was linked to the force calls in NATO. I have my doubts.
All right. Well, on that note, thank you both. This was enlightening, fascinating. I really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Just a few brief housekeeping notes. We do have some upcoming events. This one is virtual, off the record, member only. We'll be talking about diplomacy with Iran and whether or not it can be revived with someone who is an expert on track 1.5 to negotiations with countries that the US does not have relations with. So this is member only. It should be great, July 30th. And then we have another member only event that's also for members only, virtual nuclear risks and realities, and talking about non-proliferation following the US and Israeli strikes on Iran. So with that, thank you, Rob, Sander. This was a fantastic conversation. I'd like to just thank Brian Thang and Lasse de Graaf for helping out with this event and making it work. And you can RSVP for upcoming events. And of course, we're a nonprofit and we appreciate everyone's donations, especially if you enjoyed the event. So thank you all and have a great rest of your day and evening. Bye-bye.